presented by Caltech.
Welcome to the Watson Lecture at Caltech. My name is Ravi Ravichandran. I am the chair of the Division of Engineering and Applied Science. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague and our speaker for today's Watson Lecture, Dr. Yisong Yu, Professor of Computing and Mathematical Sciences. Yisong received his BS in Computer Science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and PhD in Computer Science from Cornell University. Before joining the Caltech faculty in 2014, he was a postdoctoral researcher at Carnegie Mellon University and a research scientist at Disney Research. Yisong's research interests lie primarily in machine learning and span the entire theory to application spectrum, from foundational advances to deployment in real systems. His research has led to groundbreaking applications in diverse fields, including recommender systems, sports analytics, protein engineering, seismology, and autonomous systems. Yisong directs DOLCIT, a center that is broadly centered around research pertaining to statistical decision theory, statistical machine learning, and optimization. He is a co-founder of AI for Science, an initiative which brings together AI researchers with experts from other disciplines to push modern AI tools into every area of science and engineering. Please join me in welcoming Professor Yisong Yu, who will deliver today's Watson Lecture.
Thank you so much, Ravi, for that introduction. Let me just share my screen. Thank you all for coming. Of course, it's too bad that we couldn't do this in person, but at the same time, I think this is a great opportunity for this Watson Lecture Series to reach a much broader audience virtually. So welcome to this series wherever you are. Today, I'll be talking about some of the work that my group and I have been working on in collaboration with many people, both at Caltech and abroad, in the areas of artificial intelligence, its applications to various problems that arise in the sciences and in engineering, and how it all works and what it means for the future. So to start with, let me talk about machine learning. So for those of you who don't know, artificial intelligence can be broken down into many different subfields. And in the totality of it is about data and computation. Machine learning is a subfield of artificial intelligence that deals with how to properly convert data and experience into knowledge. And it has been the subfield of artificial intelligence that has really been transforming the field in the last 10 years. So data are the things that we've all become very familiar with these days. Commercial enterprises tend to generate lots of them, such as in social media, recommender systems, sales, etc. Increasingly, the sciences and engineering have also been generating increasing amounts of data. So it's an exciting time for machine learning today. Knowledge is typically represented as a computer model. So a model of what is contained in the data that is then stored in a piece of software. And the process of doing this is what's known as a computer algorithm. The algorithm is the software that runs on the data and then stores it into a computer model. And so what is machine learning used for? So many of these examples will come as no surprise to most of you, but just so we're all on the same page, obviously recommender systems and personalization, computational advertising, spam filtering, which I believe is one of the first successful commercial applications of machine learning, speech recognition, audio to text, things that you can do on your phone, Q&A, video game matchmaking, 3D registration, self-driving cars, autonomy in space assets increasingly, personal home robots. This is an area of very active research these days. Sports analytics, I'll talk a little bit about that. Animation, I'll also talk a little bit about that. personalized medicine. I'll also mention a little bit of the collaborations I have on that front. Behavior modeling, especially animal behaviors here at Caltech, and cell analysis or tissue level analysis, such as in disease monitoring, such as in cancer. So this is just give you a sort of a sample of the very different and diverse domains that are generating increasingly large data sets that we can harness with the power of machine learning productively to generate models that are useful for practitioners. And so the success of modern AI is really in large part due to the success of supervised learning using deep neural networks. So you have your raw data, I'll call that X. Could be, for instance, movies on Amazon, let's say. It could be a target signal that you want to predict, such as the rating on the movie. This target signal is also known as supervision in the lingo of machine learning. You give the raw data and the target signal, you give that to a computer that runs a machine learning algorithm that then produces a machine learning model that makes predictions. This model is typically implemented as what's known as a deep neural network. And this is a sort of a 10,000-foot view of how supervised learning works. I'm going to give a one-slide mathematical summary, since this is a Caltech lecture, and what good Caltech lecture doesn't have a little bit of mathematics in it. And so here's this sort of a one-slide mathematical summary of what I'm talking about. You have what's called the training data, which is basically a set of XY pairs. The X is the raw data, and the Y is the target signal. In this simple example, the signal is binary, +1 or -1. You have your model class, which is the class of models that you're going to use to learn predictions from X to Y. Here I give an explicit example of a linear model. In practice, people use more complicated models, such as decision trees or deep learning or deep neural networks. You define a loss function, which characterizes the mismatch of predicting A when the truth is B or vice versa. So, and so here's a simple one called squared loss, which characterizes how badly you're mispredicting. You compile that all into this optimization problem called a learning objective, which says, over all the training that I have, find me a model that makes good predictions that in terms of getting the target signal from the raw data. And this is what you actually implement in a machine learning software, such as TensorFlow or PyTorch, and then they have algorithms already pre-implemented that can run on this kind of objective. So this is just a sort of a 100-foot view of machine learning in a nutshell. So building on this idea of supervised learning being the workhorse of machine learning that's been so successful, let's look at a few applications. And I like to start with a fun one. This has been one of my most enjoyable collaborations over the years. This was initially started during my time at Disney Research in the application area of animation. So the idea is that we want to automatically generate high-frequency animations such as lip syncing. In practice, what an artist often has to do is manually animate the lips to synchronize with the audio. And this can be very labor intensive and quite tedious and doesn't even offer much room for creative expression. So it's a really great area to automate away, in this case, using machine learning. And so here's just a result. We'll share some links with the videos that you can find on YouTube. Here's a result where the lip syncing is done fully automatically with our approach.
Do I look funny to you? I may be a chimp, but I'm dressed better than you.
I'm a PhD specializing in computer graphics and facial animation. But at nights, I'm a level 10 operative for a secret organization.
But we are now on different frequencies.
My speech is pretty good, don't you think? Meu português é ainda melhor, não acha?
So my apologies if the frame rate is a little bit choppy. It's a little bit hard to do this over Zoom, but you can definitely check out some of the videos on YouTube and other platforms where the frame rate is better. But let's talk about how we set up this problem. So you have your input sequence. In this case, it's a sequence of phonetics, like the International Phonetic Alphabet. You have a target sequence that you want to predict, which is the sequence of the configurations of the face. You can think of this as basically a virtual puppet with some knobs and strings and pulls. And the goal is to learn a model that maps from the raw inputs, which is the phonetics, to the configurations of this virtual puppet. And so here's an example of what the training data looks like. So we have a reference face, which you see a picture of. And we asked this person to speak about 3,000 sentences. So about 8 hours of just watching this person's mouth move while he is speaking. And so you can see here that what you see in the X is a frame by frame decomposition, phonetic decomposition of the word prediction. And then what you see in the bottom is sort of how wide open the mouth is, which is the first knob in this virtual puppet face. And so as you start saying the word prediction, the mouth sharply opens, stays open for a while, closes to half closed, and then closes some more. And so that's the training data. That's what the training data looks like. We've collected hours of this training data. And then we want to learn a machine learning model that can predict this movement of the mouth from the raw phonetic sequence. And once you do that, you can fit that into a standard animation pipeline where you have your input audio. You use standard speech recognition tools, such as those available on your phone, to convert the audio to phonetics. You then use our approach to convert the phonetics to animation of a target face, of a reference face, excuse me. And then you retarget from that reference face to a target face of your choice, such as this chimp. And then after you have that high frequency animation of the lips, you import that animation into a standard editing tool such as Maya, where an animation artist can add low frequency animations such as smiling and nodding and stuff like that. So that's what the full pipeline looks like. Because we're working at the phonetics level, to a large extent, our approach is language agnostic. What that means is that if you can recognize phonetics from another language, then you can use our approach as a plug-in approach. So here's some examples.
Deutsche Wörter sind sehr viel länger als englische Wörter. Mal sehen, ob das trotzdem funktioniert.
한 가지 언어는 충분하지 못해.
Jeśli kiedykolwiek będziesz odwiedzał Polskę, polecam Kraków.
මම දළදා මාලිගාව වැඳීමට සෙනසුරාදා හවස ගියෙමි.
你们真讨厌，吃饱了喝足了就坐那儿看我说话。
We can also do singing.
Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, and the dreams that you've dreamed of once in a lullaby.
Oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside.
So I should mention that if you wanted an animation artist to animate the lips to synchronize with this type of audio at 30 frames per second, it would take a very long time. Whereas with our approach, the animation predictions happen in less than a second. So this really is something that can be quite powerful for these types of applications where these types of animations are quite tedious and would like to be automated away. So moving on to more serious pursuits, Caltech style. Supervised learning is a very powerful paradigm. Once you have your data collected in the right way, then you can just plug in and apply the latest and greatest modern deep supervised learning methods, and you get out a model that can be very powerful for a range of tasks. The simplest tasks are detection and cataloging. So here is a collaboration with my colleagues in GPS division, where they took decades of earthquake data here collected in Southern California. And that data was carefully manually curated by GPS, seismology, PhD students, and postdocs over the decades. And so now you have a reference target that's the ground truth. And now you could train an earthquake detection and cataloging system that can automate away a lot of the manual cataloging that's currently being done in many of the seismology laboratories around the world, including the Seismolab here at Caltech. And so just to give you a sense, what you see at the bottom is the X, the raw seismometer readings, and then the Y is the color coding. These are called P waves and S waves. For those of you who don't know seismology, they're two different waves that happen in an earthquake event. Supervised learning can also do things like animal behavior cataloging. So this is a collaboration with both my colleagues in computer vision and as well as in various biology labs, where the data comes in the form of animals, laboratory animals in this case, interacting with each other. And the cataloging corresponds to various activities that these animals may be engaging in, such as aggressive ones or more passive ones, just like touching. And this is important because this type of cataloging is a crucial step in the scientific evaluation of how various interventions in the brains or the genes of these animals modified their behavior. And you could think of behavior as the most complex phenotype in terms of interventions. And I should also mention, although my biology colleagues could probably comment on this in greater depth, that we now have many hours, tens, hundreds of hours of these animal behaviors, thousands of hours in some cases, that have been collected here at Caltech and outside of Caltech. And it's just ripe for using the use of machine learning to train these powerful models that can do these types of automated cataloging. Another example with my colleagues in the CCE division is in understanding what types of reactions are best predicted, can be best catalyzed with certain types of catalysts. So the basic idea here is that we want to create a certain product by reacting on a certain substrate. And the question is what type of catalyst that will do the job the best. And it turns out that there is an increasingly large repository of data exactly of that flavor, where again, you have ground truth in the form of the translation, and then you have your input, which is the reaction of interest that you want. And then the thing in the middle, which I just sort of grayed out, is the black box neural net type approach that sort of gets you from the raw input X to the target prediction Y. The thing to keep in mind is that you have the X and the Y that's collected in a careful way that's substantial enough to apply these powerful machine learning methods for. Okay, so those are some pretty exciting success stories. Some of them more preliminary, some of them in deployment right now. But as we look ahead to how AI can make an impact in the sciences and engineering, through this interaction, I've also come to realize, both myself and my group and my collaborators, that there are challenges for modern AI that we must deal with in order to make AI more broadly applicable in the sciences and in engineering. And so this is not an exhaustive list. This is really 4 items that I personally have become quite invested in over time, but it is by no means exhaustive. And the 4 are, for me, what if the data is incomplete or the data description is incomplete? What if these supervised labels, this ground truth target, is not available a priori? What if the prediction space is highly complex, where we're not just predicting presence or absence of a P wave or an S wave? And what if we need to certify other properties as we build these learning-based or data-driven systems, such as certifying safety in an autonomous vehicle? And so let's start by thinking about the first one. What if the data description is incomplete? And to ground this particular thought experiment, let's look at an application that I worked on in collaboration with Stats, which is a sports analytics company, ESPN, and Disney, which is this application in sports analytics called ghosting. What ghosting is you take a replay where your team was scored on, and in normal ghosting, the coaches would annotate the replay to tell the defense where they should have been to have defended the play better. As you can imagine, this is a very time-consuming process. And so one thought was, well, let's just take a big data set, perhaps of teams that are better defenders than our team, and then train a machine learning model on that target data to automatically ghost replays, which is what you're seeing right here in the white. So what used to be a very labor-intensive process now can be done automatically to the extent that you like the defensive style of the teams that you train your model on. What's interesting about this particular application that we worked on was that if you take an off-the-shelf, state-of-the-art deep learning approach to this problem, you get a result that looks like this, where the white is our prediction. And it doesn't really look very good. It looks like a bunch of 7-year-olds playing soccer. So what's the problem? The problem is in the description of the data, or in other words, state representation, which is another commonly used phrase in the machine learning lingo. In particular, for this particular application, you need to know, let's say, the location of the goalkeeper, the XY coordinates of the goalkeeper, the XY coordinates of the left back, the XY coordinates of the left center back, and so on and so forth. That is what is called a consistent description or a representation of the state to feed into deep neural networks. Unfortunately, for this application, we don't know who the left center back is. We don't know who the left back is. And if you talk to sports analysts and coaches, they'll tell you that whoever is playing the role of a left center back or left back switches over time throughout the course of the gameplay. So not only do we not have this data described properly, it's also highly dynamic, so it's very expensive to describe. In other words, we don't know who plays which role. In machine learning lingo, you can think of role as a quote unquote latent variable. And so all we get in terms of the training data is this unordered set of trajectories. And so we need to solve this permutation problem to unscramble the trajectories into their roles. Now, the naive baseline that I described to you just before, the state-of-the-art approach, just directly applied on this data set and ignored this permutation problem. That's why it didn't work so well. And so I'm not going to go into the details, but my former PhD student Huang actually developed a new machine learning approach that combined modern deep learning with inferring these roles automatically using Bayesian techniques to be able to get this joint approach that was able to do both simultaneously. One of the interesting things is that once you do this, then you can actually visualize what the roles that were learned by this joint approach were. And so this model was fit on the English Premier League 2012-2013 season. And you can see here in this visualization that the dominant defensive formation, which you can pull out of our model, is 4-4-2, if you're familiar with soccer. Okay, moving on. What if the supervised labels, that ground truth label, the thing that we need to do supervised learning, what if it's not available? And so to think about this concretely, I like to talk about conventional supervised learning as batch or passive learning, where you have your data, you have your signal, you train. But the thing is, all the data, the X and the Ys, they're all collected up front, and then we train. In contrast, in interactive learning, rather than passive learning, the data is not collected up front, or the target signals Y are not collected up front. And we could think about this specifically in the context of experiment design, where we have some experimental platform that's becoming increasingly high throughput or automatable. And then we have our experiment designer that's designing experiments and then taking measurements. That's become automated or semi-automated. The experiment designer designs an experiment. The description of the experiment is our X. We run the experiment, we take a measurement. That measurement is our Y, and then we repeat. And so this is iterative and adaptive rather than passive. We're collecting more ground truth measurements on the fly, rather than having all of the experiments done a priori and then doing the analysis afterwards. And we want to typically do this in a way that maximizes some goal, gets us towards some goal, such as finding the best protein for a certain function or finding the best treatment for a certain clinical setting. And so there are many applications for this kind of goal-oriented interactive experiment design, ranging from calibration of controllers and robotics to drug discovery to material design and protein design and so on and so forth. So I'd like to ground this in a couple of examples. The first is a collaboration with my colleague Joe Burdick in treating lower spine injuries. So what you see in this picture is a subject who suffered a damage to his spine. And so he can no longer stand or walk of his own power. So he's effectively paralyzed. And what Joel has been working on is this, using this Medtronic epidural electrostimulator array, which generates an electromagnetic field that's implanted inside the spinal column, close to the spinal cord. And the induced electromagnetic field will hopefully help this subject regain some amount of lower limb mobility or lower limb function. Now, one of the things that's challenging in this particular setting is that the ground truth data, how well does this particular person respond to this treatment, that supervised signal is only collectible from this particular patient, at least in this simple example. And so, of course, each patient is unique. Their injury is unique. There's even variability in where the device is implanted. And so understanding how to collect data purposefully to get ground truth measurements from the subject is one of the challenges that my group has studied a lot over the last few years. And so here's the setup. We have this array that we're controlling with an algorithm. We have our subject. We apply stimulus from the array. We take a measurement of how well this patient is standing. That's the ground truth. And then we update our model, and then we repeat. That's the basic idea. And so I won't go into the description of the algorithms, but this idea has been quite successful. We've even tested it in the laboratory setting. And so here's an example where this particular subject has been, I believe, paralyzed for over 2 years. And this, I believe, is his first time standing with the help of this type of treatment, with their stimuli guided by AI algorithms. Okay, we can also apply the same technique for human-based personalization, not just to invasive stimulation, but also to things like exoskeletons, where you personalize the gait parameters of an exoskeleton to maximize the comfort of the subject who is using the exoskeleton. Very similar mathematical tools on the AI side, but now applied to a very different domain. Another instance of this type of paradigm is in nano-photonics. So this is a collaboration with my colleague Harry Atwater in applied physics, where Harry's group is interested in designing nano-photonic structures or photonic nanostructures. Where you see here on the left is basically a photon well that traps a photon, and then the slit at the bottom filters out a specific filters for a specific wavelength of light. And so this particular structure is parameterized by things like the oxide thickness, the slit width, the mirror spacing, etc. And then you can then design various filters like this, put them in a superpixel, and then design next generation cameras. The primary motivating application, although there are others for this type of technology, if we can design them well, is in hyperspectral imaging, where the goal is to put these types of hyperspectral, highly sensitive camera filters on, let's say, a satellite camera that can take images and then do the analysis from these narrowband filtering. So here's the learning setup. We want to be able to design or tune the parameters of this structure to optimize for a specific wavelength of light. And so the AI algorithm chooses a design, which is the X. In this case, we could also choose the simulation type to use. Some simulations are cheaper than others, but less accurate. And then we get a measurement back. And so at a mathematical level, you get the exact same setup at the mathematical level. Of course, then you need to be able to apply this mathematical approach to this new domain, which is very different from stimulating humans with paralysis. But nonetheless, a lot of this, the same mathematical principles apply. Another example is the groundbreaking work by my colleague Francis Arnold in protein design using a method called directed evolution. There's a way to view directed evolution as a form of interactive experiment design. And you can think about ways of taking a machine learning perspective to this workflow and actually modeling the process mathematically as a form of interactive machine learning. So we've had a number of collaborations in this space as well. In this particular example, the raw representation X is the representation of proteins, which are represented as amino acid chains. And then the target signal is some measurement of fitness of the protein after you synthesized it and take a measurement, such as its ability to fluoresce under certain conditions, or its ability to, let's say, bind to a certain antigen marker, or its ability to be stable under various temperatures, and so on and so forth. So you can design many different target signals that you want to measure. And again, the process of measuring the signal is very expensive because you actually have to synthesize the protein in the lab and then grow the proteins, typically in bacteria, and then take that measurement. In a completely different setting where we are challenged by the cost of acquiring ground truth supervised labels is the area where the ground truth supervised labels are the result of human annotations. So this arises prominently in behavior analysis and behavior cataloging. So here is an example of a setting from my colleague David Anderson in BBE, where you have two mice interacting socially, and the behaviors need to be cataloged. And one of the biggest bottlenecks is actually having a human annotate this video for its behaviors, which can take hours and hours of work. And so one of the projects that we've been working on in collaboration with computer vision researchers is understanding how to build these models that require increasingly less amounts of supervised annotations in order to perform well. And so here's just one preliminary result, where the x-axis is the amount of supervised labels you need in a log scale, and then the y-axis is the error. And the orange line is our new approach. The blue line is a normal, standard supervised learning approach. And the takeaway that I want you to get away from this figure is that in this preliminary work, we can achieve the same level of accuracy in terms of behavior cataloging with only 10% of the human annotation. So now this result holds up in a broader setting. What that means is that a biology PhD student will now need to annotate only 1/10 the amount of behaviors in the videos as before to achieve the same amount of cataloging accuracy. So this is very exciting preliminary work. Okay, moving right on. So what if the prediction space is complex? In a lot of the examples that I showed you, we're just predicting the existence or absence of an earthquake, or in the simple case, but the prediction space can be much more complicated than that. So here's just one example where we're doing tissue level prediction, or at least that's the ultimate goal, where you have an image plate of cells, and the goal is to do this full tissue level analysis of this image plate of cells extracted from a tissue. In this case, understanding the behavior of tumor progression. And so the prediction here is not just a single cell, but collectively over a population of cells. So that's what I mean by complex predictions. And whether or not you think a certain cell is a tumor cell or not may depend on its relationship to other cells in this plate. And so this complicated relationship is what I mean by complex prediction. So this is just one example. Another example is forecasting behaviors. So this is work using, in this case, using sports analytics in the sports analytics domain, although you can think about it more broadly in behaviors in general. And so here's just an example where we trained a model on NBA replays, so from the National Basketball Association, excuse me. And then this model can then, from any initial condition, forecast what might happen in the future. And so this requires modeling, predictions of all 5 players simultaneously, predictions over multiple time scales. And so it's much more complicated than just predicting a single variable. And the square boxes are what's called macro goals, where the agent wants to go. So I'll just play this video again. So this model is jointly modeling both multiple timescales and multiple agents simultaneously. And you could even do probabilistic reasoning. So for this third figure, if you roll out from the same initial conditions for the green player, you see that you get this bimodal distribution of outcomes. You see that there's 2 plausible outcomes that our model thinks can happen in the future by doing this forecasting multiple times. Okay, the last category. What if we need to certify other properties, such as safety, in a learning-based decision system? And so I want to start off this last section with a quote that an aerospace director said to me some years ago when he was visiting Caltech. And he said, "Yisong, I want to use deep learning to optimize the design, manufacture, and operation of our aircrafts, but I need some guarantees." So what are guarantees? So the guarantees that are typically studied in, let's say, aerodynamics are things like stability. So can you prove that your aircraft will never destabilize under nominal operating conditions? Safety. Can you prove that your aircraft will never leave a safety envelope under nominal operating conditions? There are sort of simpler special cases of safety and stability, like smoothness. Can you prove that the trajectory that you will follow is provably smooth? And I should also mention that there are other guarantees that arise in other systems as well, such as fairness, low risk, logical guarantees, and so on and so forth, those arise more prominently in socio-technological systems, such as recommender systems for predicting loans and other things like that. My research to date has been more focused on guarantees that are relevant in dynamical systems, such as where safety and stability and smoothness are prominent. But I think the mathematical ideas that we've been exploring sort of can be mathematically applied more broadly. And so to ground this, I like to talk about first an application that started while I was at Disney, but has then continued after I joined Caltech. And that's an application in automated broadcasting. So the basic idea is that we are tracking the behavior of agents in a game, like in this case, a basketball game, where we're also tracking the behavior of a human broadcast camera operator that's operating the broadcast camera to compose footage that consumers see. So that's the target or the supervised label. The goal then is to be able to map what's happening on the court to where to point the camera. And once you learn that mapping or model, then you can implement that on an autonomous robotic broadcast camera. And so one of the things that's really important in this setting is smoothness. It's not good enough to be able to accurately track the human broadcast camera operator. You have to track that person's behavior and also be smooth at the same time. If you do not track the behavior smoothly and you jitter a lot, then it leads to a very unpleasant viewing experience. And so we developed an approach that simultaneously was able to track accurately and provably smoothly. So we have a proof, a mathematical proof that our behavior will be smooth. And so here's just a depiction of our result. So our predictions overlaid on top of the original broadcast footage. The left is a baseline that's not able to guarantee smoothness, and the right is our approach. And so you can get the behavior like the one you see on the right, now implemented on an autonomous broadcast camera. It was also very fun to work on this project because I believe this was the first time that a machine learning project was covered on Sports Illustrated. Other applications that we worked on here at Caltech include helping robotic systems deal with boundary conditions. So one common boundary condition or one prominent boundary condition is the ground. So landing a drone is actually a very challenging task in order to do so accurately with high precision, because the ground acts as a boundary condition that perturbs the nominal aerodynamics models that are used when designing drone controllers. And so the idea that we took is, okay, we're going to figure out how to precisely inject machine learning into the aerodynamic controllers of a drone. And so this slide, you don't need to understand the formulas in this slide. The main takeaway is that this is a very standard aerodynamics model of drone. And the only thing that we use machine learning for is this residual FA. Everything else is standard. We just apply the deep learning to learn this very last component, which models the interaction between the drone and the ground. And because we do this with this level of precision, you can actually collect the data very efficiently. And you get a result that looks like this, where now, because we can model the ground effect, we can do high precision flying of drones close to boundary conditions such as the ground. And so here's just one demonstration of that. So this type of capability would not have been possible with standard drone controllers that cannot model the ground accurately. Okay, so we can do this with not just the ground. You can also think of neighboring drones as mobile boundary conditions. For example, one drone on top of another drone will produce what's called the downwash effect that pushes the other drone down. And so once you can do this once, you can apply the same mathematical principle and model mobile boundary conditions such as other drones and get high precision, tight, dense formation flying with standard hardware and controllers. I should mention that there was one aspect of this work that did require innovation in the control side, if you're interested, which is compensating for the time delay, because of the highly dynamical nature of the forces, compensating for time delay became very important. Okay, so just to conclude, what are some of the underlying principles behind all the examples that I've talked about today? The first is we need to collect data. Either the data has to be collected well up front, or we need a process to collect the data intelligently on the fly with a budget constraint. To the extent possible, we should exploit existing domain knowledge. Rather than train a black box deep neural net on everything, figure out where's the place where machine learning applied judiciously and with precision will give you the biggest bang for the buck, because that reduces your data needs. You compile that into a standard optimization problem. This is now very standard these days. You can just use a off-the-shelf machine learning library such as PyTorch or TensorFlow, and then you profit. So that's sort of the underlying principles. And I hope I've convinced you that, while these underlying principles are very powerful, we still need to deal with many challenges in order to extend modern AI to be more applicable to a whole host of challenges that arise in science and engineering, such as what if the data description is incomplete? What if the supervised labels are not available a priori? What if the prediction space is very complicated? And what if we need to certify properties such as safety in a learning-based decision system? And so if you can do that, you can then apply these type of techniques to a whole host of applications. And I'm very excited about what the future holds. I want to leave you all with a word of caution, and that's that machine learning reveals and amplifies what is in the data that you've collected. Furthermore, if your data is not fully descriptive, which is always the case, then machine learning fills in the gaps using modeling assumptions that are baked into the machine learning approach. And this can lead to problematic outcomes, such as a conversational robot on social media, such as Twitter, learning the language of the people that it interacts with. So it's trained in this sort of very problematic way, because the data is collected in a problematic way. It can lead to encoding biases of the human processes that generated the data. So if the data you're training are outcomes of human decision processes, like hiring decisions, and that data then is generated in a biased way, then training on that data will basically encode that bias into the machine learning model. And so make sure your data is good, make sure your modeling assumptions are good. And this is, of course, a topic of contemporary research of huge importance in modern society. And so with that, I'm done. I'm happy to take questions. You can learn more about my research on my website, yisong.com. You can also follow me on social media, where I comment on all manner of machine learning happenings. And so that concludes my presentation. Happy to take questions.